Tonight on KQED Newsroom, what did President Trump know about hush money paid to a porn actress? And fights over California immigration and environmental policies. We'll hear from Congressman Adam Schiff. A ruling by the state's highest courts could disrupt the gig economy by increasing worker protections and benefits. Plus, the California GOP Convention kicks off this weekend with a focus on firing up voters and a potential gubernatorial endorsement. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with politics. This week, President Trump acknowledged in a series of tweets that he repaid his personal lawyer for a $130,000 payment made to porn actress Stormy Daniels. She claims he had an affair with her in 2006. The tweets contradicted earlier statements by Trump when he said he did not know about the payment. One of the president's new attorneys, Rudy Giuliani, first reveals the reimbursement in an interview on Fox News on Wednesday. Also on the national agenda, signs of progress in talks with North Korea. Here now to discuss this, along with California political developments, is Congressman Adam Schiff. He joins us from Burbank. Congressman, nice to see you again.
Thanks, Thuy.
Oh, you're on the House Intelligence Committee. What is your reaction to the Trump administration now saying that 3 U.S. prisoners held by North Korea may soon be released?
Well, I don't think they should really be talking about it until the deal is sealed. Now, I would fully expect that in order for the president to sit down with Kim Jong-un to give Kim that meeting that he's always wanted with the U.S. president to sit effectively on the same stage, that at a minimum we would get our hostages back. But I don't think you should send out this president's lawyer's new lawyer, Giuliani, to make this announcement when it's not clear that that deal has been struck. And I don't think the president should be suggesting it either. I think it undermines his own leverage.
And is there any reason to be very optimistic right now in terms of the long overall strategy? North Korea has released American prisoners in the past, including college student Otto Warmbier, and then shifted back to violent threats and confrontation. Are you optimistic that there is a signal here of any long-term diplomatic strategy by Kim Jong-un?
Well, there's an opening, and I think we need to test to see whether the North Koreans are serious. But you're absolutely right. There's a history here of confrontation followed by conciliation, followed by confrontation again, and they're coming to the table. Look, I think it's a great advance on where we were last year when the president and Kim Jong-un were comparing the size of their nuclear buttons. But no one should expect that this is going to be easy sledding or the North Koreans are simply going to walk away from their nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program. It's going to be a tough negotiation, and they are going to seek to divide us from our allies, from the South Koreans and Japanese. And the president is going to need to make sure there's no daylight between us. He has not been very good at that, and he needs to realize that things are going to get more difficult before this is done. But we should give it a chance. We should test whether the North Koreans are serious.
I also want to get your thoughts on the whole Stormy Daniels situation as well. What's your reaction to revelations that President Trump reimbursed his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, for a payment intended to keep Stormy Daniels from going public about an alleged affair with the president?
Well, it just shows you what a surreal world we're in, where the legal strategy that Giuliani announced during this Fox debut was, our defense is you can't believe the President of the United States. So when he said earlier that he hadn't been aware of this payment, he wasn't telling the truth. That's our defense. That's not much of a defense. And what's more, and I think this is why they're trying to walk Giuliani back now, if the president was aware of this payment, did reimburse Michael Cohen, and that payment, that loan of money was a campaign finance law violation, that means the president is now implicated in that. So the more fundamental problem is they're not committed to telling the truth, and this is why the versions keep changing.
Let's say there are no violations of actual law found here. Are there ethical violations?
Well, there are certainly lots of ethical violations, particularly if Michael Cohen were making this payment to silence Stormy Daniels and not telling his client about it. That would put his legal practice in jeopardy, his legal license in jeopardy. If Stormy Daniels was threatened as a way to get her to take the deal, that's a very different problem. And then, of course, there's the problem of the president's credibility, that he's paying hush money to porn stars, that he's not being truthful about it, that he's coming up with 15 different explanations. All of this, I think, detracts from the standing of the President of the United States and indeed our standing around the world.
Meanwhile, the Mueller investigation is proceeding. The New York Times recently released a list of more than 4 questions that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, would like to ask President Trump. You're a former federal prosecutor yourself. What do you think Mr. Mueller is trying to determine through these questions?
Well, so many of the questions dealt with obstruction of justice. Others dealt with the issue of collusion. It certainly says to me that Bob Mueller feels there's more work that he needs to do on both issues. And in particular, he needs to get to the president's intent. Did he intend to obstruct the Russia investigation by firing the person who was leading that investigation for the FBI, that being the FBI director? Did he basically tell the FBI director to drop the criminal case against Michael Flynn? Was that also an act of obstruction of justice? But the president's intent is really key, and so many of the questions go to exactly that.
Let's talk about the head of the Environmental Protection Agency as well, Scott Pruitt. As you know, he is facing multiple investigations related to his spending and his management practices. Do you think he should resign?
He should absolutely resign. He should have never been appointed in the first place. He's an ideologue who knows little about or cares little about the environment, and he certainly turned that agency on its head. But given all the misconduct in office, and it just keeps multiplying every day, there are new problems, new allegations, new evidence of impropriety. The administration ought to just get rid of him. And I can only think that this is the president deciding that firing him would be yet another admission of guilt. But they are quite far from draining the swamp. They seem to be licensing the swamp and branding it with great big gold letters that say Trump. So I think he's a real problem for the administration, but more importantly, his anti-environmental policies are a problem for the rest of the country.
Just this week, California filed a lawsuit seeking to reinstate the state's ability to force stricter auto emission standards. This is now one of more than 30 lawsuits the state has filed against the Trump administration. Do you feel like they're making a difference, these lawsuits?
I do, and you know, thank goodness for our governor, our attorney general, and just the degree to which California has stepped into the void. The governor of California now is the global leader on climate change. When the president walked out of that climate accord, the governor stepped forward, and thank goodness that he did. We need to fight these reversals in environmental policy that Pruitt and others are trying to put forward. We've improved the quality of our air in California. Here in Los Angeles, it's much better than it had been in the 1970s, and the higher fuel emission standards are part of the solution. It's good for our state. It's good for the other states that are also suing the federal government. And it's good for the planet.
But not everyone in California agrees with what the state is doing. An increasing number of communities are now taking legal action or enacting resolutions, officially stating their opposition to the sanctuary laws. What are your thoughts to this backlash?
Well, I think what California did makes a lot of sense. It basically said we're not going to turn our law enforcement into an arm of the Border Patrol or the BCIS. That, yes, we'll work with immigration authorities when there are people who are here, who are undocumented, who've committed very serious crimes, but we're not going to simply become an arm of the president's very regressive immigration policies. Now, that wasn't going to please everybody, even in a progressive state like California, and so you see some of these very conservative communities say, no, we're with Trump on his regressive immigration policies. But that's not where most Californians are. Indeed, that's not where most Americans are. I have to say, this is the first president in my lifetime who simply doesn't seem to understand that part of his job, a big part of his job, is to make us a more perfect union. This president is determined to divide us, and that is so deeply destructive.
All right, Congressman Adam Schiff joining us from Burbank. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Twee.
This week, the California State Supreme Court issued a big victory for those who work in the so-called gig economy, people who take jobs at varying times and places, like those who drive for Uber and Lyft. The lawsuit was originated by courier and delivery workers at a company called Dynamex, who said they should be considered employees, not contractors. In its ruling, the court said companies must prove that workers operate their own business in order to classify them as independent contractors. The ruling could grant gig workers benefits such as rest breaks and overtime pay. Joining us now to discuss this issue are KQED Silicon Valley reporter Sam Harnett, UC Hastings College of the Law Associate Professor Vina Dubal, and Edward Escobar, who drives for Uber. Welcome to you all. Professor Duvall, how significant is this ruling?
Oh, it's a seismic shift. It's huge. It really lowers the barrier for workers to be determined to be employees. It shifts the burden onto employers, to hiring entities, to prove that their workers are actually not employees.
And there's now a three-pronged test. So what?
Yeah, so it shifted the test from sort of this capacious idea of whether or not the hiring entity controlled the worker, and it said, okay, we're actually going to put the burden on the employer. We're going to presume that these people are employees, and you, employer, you prove to us that actually you have hired an independent contractor, and the test is amazingly simple. So it moves away from the common law test, and it says you have to prove three things to us if you want us to believe that this worker is an independent contractor. You have to prove that you do not control or direct this person at all. You have to prove that this person is not a part of your everyday business. They're doing something different than what you do, and that this person is engaged in sort of a customarily conceived of independent contractor sort of work. And the second prong in particular is huge, because you can imagine with Uber, the question would be, is Uber are Uber drivers doing something different than what Uber is doing? And the answer is, of course, no.
So then, Edward, you drive full-time, essentially, for both Uber and Lyft. What do you think of this ruling? Do you think of yourself as a contractor or an employee?
Well, I'd like to think that I'm an independent contractor, but we're being treated less than employees, and that's a real problem. Because when Uber and Lyft are playing this game of ignorant denial and using this misclassification of employment to blow out their infrastructure on a global level, then that's not requiring them to contribute their fair share contribution to the worker safety net, and that's not fair, just, or equitable.
So for you, what will you do? What will you do now? Will you take legal action and challenge your status as a contractor and try to get employee status?
Of course, of course. It empowers us to unite and speak up for our rights.
And Sam, how are the companies responding? Companies that are engaged in these kinds of, so-called gig economy contracts.
Well, since the beginning, all these companies have said that they're platforms. I mean, Uber and Lyft have always said, we're not in the taxi business, we're a platform, we connect riders and drivers. And that's been their argument that sort of allowed them to evade this question for a long time. And I expect that a lot of tech companies are going to continue trying to convince people that they're really technology companies and that they're platforms not providing the service directly themselves.
And I wonder, going back to your point, Edward, about, driving for Uber, why do you do that? Do you enjoy the freedoms? Do you enjoy the work?
Well, I think that there's this phony freedom that's being sold to the public, that the drivers are able to earn a living. I look at it as earning a surviving, and that's where it's gone to. I started driving 4 years ago, and since then, it's not just spiraled, it's nosedive. So I think that there's some serious concerns here that have to be addressed regarding the driver's rights. And let's put the onus and the responsibility back on the tech firms, because Uber and Lyft are basically spearheading this abuse of the worker safety net.
There are some, though, who would argue that you have certain freedoms and flexibility by doing this type of work, right? You still get to decide when you work, how many hours a day you work.
Not really. The freedom and flexibility is not true, because you have to work when the demand is there. And the demand is early in the morning, and it's later in the afternoon, late at night. So it's really not true. That is basically a spin job that's being done. And
I think it's also important to note that this decision is not about all aspects of employee status. It's really about minimum wage and minimal working conditions. So just because someone is an employee under California law for minimum wage purposes does not make them an employee for other purposes. So, Edward might still be an independent contractor under the National Labor Relations Act, which uses a different test for employee status. And what the California Supreme Court did in this decision beautifully was to say, look, workers need to make enough money to feed their families. And in this economy, that's not happening. We're simplifying this test. We're going to ensure for basic wage purposes that people are making a minimum wage, that if they're working more than 40 hours a week, that they're getting overtime.
I thought it was interesting that in the decision they also the opinion said that this is mischaracterization of workers is a huge problem, and not only is it hurting workers because of the safety net, but it's also costing taxpayers billions of dollars in lost taxes by mischaracterizing workers.
Yeah, taxpayers are subsidizing it in the end.
And the numbers of people doing this type of work is growing, right? Because there are studies that show that in the past decade or so, that population has grown to the point where it's nearly 16% of the workforce now. Mm-hmm. And so the number will keep increasing. So these are questions that need to get settled. But there are some freelancers out there who look at this situation and say, but you know what? When you work for some of these companies, and you know, there's Uber, there's Lyft, there's TaskRabbit, there's many other companies out there. They, aside from your point, they get some level of flexibility and freedom. So isn't there a trade-off? You know,
I think the trade-off
should you be entitled
never
to
be substandard living conditions, right? That's the idea here. And I don't think that there's anything about employment necessarily that necessitates lack of flexibility or freedom. I'm an employee and I have a very flexible and free work schedule. I think that that's sort of the company line that needs to be undermined.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a false choice, right? Like if you said to someone, would you like to be employed and have health care and benefits and retirement and kind of do a job that you really love and have a lot of freedom, I think people would go for that. I think a lot of the Uber and Lyft drivers that I've interviewed are doing it out of desperation, you know, for a second job or a third job, and maybe they do like some of the flexibility, but at the end of the day, they're just trying to, you know, to make rent or
survive.
Yeah.
So there's not those sustainability factors that Veena was speaking to, and that's a serious problem because you see this bait and switch. They promise the American dream, but the workers are waking up to the American nightmare, and that's the reality of driving.
And even in the marketing, Uber's always talking about creating entrepreneurs. And I've never met a driver who describes themselves as an entrepreneur. I mean, I think they say, oh, I'm independent maybe, but never that I have my own business and I'm building something for myself.
The business side of this, some of the businesses argue that you know, converting contractors to employees would cost them money. It could cost a business anywhere from 25 to 40% more per worker to make this conversion. Is there a risk here that it could lead some smaller gig economy companies to go out of business and thus lead to people losing jobs?
Well, I was thinking about this. I mean, if you change the rule and the model and everyone now has to abide by this, then yeah, maybe venture capitalists would have to kick in a little bit more money. And if you want to start a company, you'd have to start you know, paying people a little bit better to begin with. So it might change the model a little bit. But again, if it's kind of across the board, it just might require a little more startup capital.
I think it's going to fair competition.
And meaning what?
Meaning that there needs to be certain requirements that are basic minimums on par with the taxi industry. It needs to be, I mean, the taxi industry had these certain requirements because it's been tested and proven for many years for public safety, for the environment. There's a lot of concerns that are impacting society, and these are adverse. So we need to address those now before it gets much worse.
So do you think that companies like Uber and Lyft, for example, have gotten a free ride, pardon the pun, you know, of not having to contribute to the social safety net to workers' compensation, for example?
Absolutely. And what they've been trying to do is experiment in different states with, you know, new market-based workers' compensation models. And I mean, in many ways, they're just putting Band-Aids on what is otherwise a horrific wound in the body of the working class. And this is a great effort by the state of California to say, you know, there's some responsibilities associated with being a big business, and own up to those responsibilities. Pay your workers. And
you're looking at privatization of public transportation. The target for them is not taxis. It's now buses. It's Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART system. They're having to reduce service. They're being impacted.
So what do you think Uber needs to change? And if you feel this way about driving for Uber, why are you working for them?
I work with, and I'm an advocate. And we are lobbying to affect positive change. That's why I've stayed in the trenches.
What would you like to see Uber change?
Well, Uber and Lyft, I'd like to see them contribute their fair share contribution to the workers' safety net and assume the full responsibility and not build their business model, unsustainable business model, on the backs of drivers.
And Sam, in the broader labor picture, could this provide yet another nudge for companies to automate faster?
I think the speed of automation is really driven by technological change. I mean, I think if Uber and Lyft had self-driving cars that could operate well and function, they would go to that tomorrow. So I don't really see that directly connected. What I would say, though, is that this whole discussion about what kind of companies Uber and Lyft actually are, is something we're seeing all through technology companies. We're starting to think, well, what is Facebook actually? Is it a media company? What is Airbnb? Is it actually a hotel company? This whole defense of being a platform, I think, is getting a lot more scrutiny, and this is yet another example.
And Professor Dubois, this ruling, what are the implications nationwide? Could it extend well beyond California?
Oh, absolutely. I think that what we're going to start seeing is a blue state and red state divide with regard to employee status. So Washington, Colorado, New York, these are states that all look to California to think about how they're going to redefine their laws. And I would not be surprised at all in the next few years to see some of those shifts in these states.
And in fact, that three-pronged test you mentioned at the top of the segment for determining whether someone's a contractor or an employee, that's already in place in Massachusetts and New Jersey.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for a really wonderful discussion. Sam Harnett with KQED, Vina Dubois with UC Hastings College of the Law, and Uber driver Edward Escobar. Nice to have you here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
The California Republican Party Spring Convention kicks off this weekend in San Diego. Delegates will decide whether to endorse California State Assemblyman Travis Allen or venture capitalist John Cox in their bids to be the state's next governor. Both candidates have spoken out against the state's sanctuary policies, limiting cooperation between local law enforcement and immigration agents. They also support a proposed ballot initiative that would repeal a hike on gas tax and vehicle registration fees. KQED political reporter Marisa Lagos is covering the convention in San Diego, and she joins us now via Skype. Hi, Marisa.
Hey, Twee. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with the California governor's race. This weekend, GOP delegates will decide who gets the nod. Will it be John Cox or Travis Allen? What do you think?
You know, Travis Allen seems to have a lot of grassroots support. He's been working very hard to get local county Republican parties on board and a lot of the delegates here. It seems like the party leadership and sort of folks at the top are going for Cox. We saw House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy endorse him just Thursday. We've seen some other congressional Republicans come out in support. But it's up to the delegates. And, you know, I think it could be close and, you know, they could not endorse anyone.
Well, John Cox did pretty well in some recent polling. Will that help his chances, do you think?
It might. You know, I think that sometimes we forget that the party faithful and the general electorate can be very different constituents. And I think that in this case, some of the things that Travis Allen has been talking about have resonated. I mean, you're right. They're both, you know, for repealing the gas tax. They're both against the sanctuary state law. They're both talking about taxes being too high and Democrats kind of leading to some of the problems that California has. But they're very different people. Travis Allen is a lot more allied with Donald Trump. He is an assemblyman. Cox is a businessman. He hasn't run for office in California before. And so, you know, in some ways, he's the outsider being embraced by the insiders.
But he did. But he was in a virtual tie with Democrat Antonio Villaraigosa in a recent PPIC poll, the Public Policy Institute.
That's right. And, you know, Allen's been polling pretty well. Another poll from UC Berkeley had them, Allen and Cox, ahead of Villaraigosa. So I think that's really the message Republicans want to get out this weekend, is that we have a chance of getting into this November runoff. It's a top two, so they're not guaranteed a spot in November. And I think that they really, really want to see a GOP candidate come out ahead, whichever one it is.
And on the congressional front, Democrats are hoping to flip as many as half of the 14 congressional districts now held by Republicans in California. That would help them win back control of the House. How heated is that battle right now?
I mean, I think in the districts, people are probably starting to hear a lot more about it. Tonight, Friday night, we're expecting Representative Mimi Walters to talk, some other Republicans, Devin Nunes from the Central Valley. And so, you know, they're definitely going to be here. And, you know, one thing that is a consideration is having, again, a governor candidate in November will really help rally folks and to come to the party faithful, to come to the ballot. And so I think it's all sort of tied together. There's a lot of calculations going on right now.
Well, only 25% of California voters are registered as Republicans. So aside from the candidates, which are the issues that are likely to energize GOP voters?
Well, you can see behind me part of a poster for repeal the gas tax. I think that is a big part of their strategy is to get this on the ballot and to try to really talk to voters about that tax and sort of tie it to the overall leadership of Democrats. And there's a really wide range of potential ballot measures for November, but those can go both ways. So I think these candidate races are going to be very important to them. And again, to have standard bearers both from congressional races up to the Republican ticket, governor's ticket, really talking about all of those issues is a big thing for them.
And it seems like it's getting a lot of national attention too, right? The campaign committees for House Speaker Paul Ryan and also House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who's from Bakersfield, have both contributed to a group that is pushing for this repeal of the gas tax increase.
That's right, which I think Democrats think is ironic since a lot of state legislatures led by Republicans have done this in other states. But they see this as a winning issue. They see this as a way to both raise money and to raise awareness of their candidates and, to repeal a tax that they don't like, just straight up. So I think it is something that we are going to be hearing a lot about in the coming months.
And what about California's sanctuary state policies? Because we're now seeing a small but growing number of communities around the state that are opposing the policies. How important is this issue to GOP party leaders?
Well, along with the gas tax, this is the other thing you hear Cox and Allen talk about the most when they are on the stump. It is a winner with Republican voters. 88% of Republican likely voters in a recent poll said they opposed the sanctuary law. But more than half of overall voters in that same poll said they support it. So I think that's an interesting gamble. Coming into the primary, it's a great way to rally the party faithful. But does that message really play in a state with 10 million immigrants?
And this week, 2 more communities added their names to the list, right? The city of Costa Mesa in Orange County and Tuolumne County in Northern California passed resolutions against California's sanctuary policy. But that is now begging the question among some critics, is this orchestrated by GOP party leaders or is it truly a grassroots effort?
That's right. We saw an LA Times report just this week, which found an invitation to a Fresno County sort of training session where folks from the, former RNC Republican National Committee folks and some people who are very involved in some anti-immigrant groups are offering sort of training to local officials. And so that, caused some blowback. I think it's one of those things that it's probably a little bit of both. There is some coordination happening at the national level and with the party, but there's also a lot of anger among grassroots Republicans about it.
All right, Marisa Lagos in San Diego reporting for us from the GOP State Convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Twee.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Twee Vu. Thank you for joining us.